right. Good afternoon, everyone. I know you're out there. These lights are so bright that I know you're out there. So welcome, everybody. It's I just think there's a great buzz today, and first face-to-face annual meeting in 3 years. It's great to reconnect face-to-face with some old friends and so many new friends today. First thing I need to do, otherwise I don't want to forget this. I just want to express our gratitude to SAS and the fact that they've invited us to use this world-class, amazing conference center. It's fantastic. And SAS has been a benefactor of the Roundtable and of PDS from the very beginning. I truly think it's hard to see how we would exist without their sponsorship from the beginning. And we're lucky to have Jim Goodnight in the back corner there. Jim, give everybody a wave, please. I know you're modest, but, and Gail Stevens, who's head of the Health Care Solutions part of SAS, who is also a great friend and supporter of the Roundtable. And you know, another person who's been from the very, very start, I want to acknowledge back row. I guess all the foundational people are in the back row. Marty Murphy is back there. Many of you know Marty. You know, he and Bob Ingram, who you'll see over these next 2 days, you know, together with President Bush 41, conceived of this. So in a very real way, all the accomplishments that you'll hear about and all the potential, it all kind of springs from those people. And Marty really made it real. He took that vision and made it real. So thank you, Marty. Okay, as I said, we have lots of new faces here. We've got our newest partners, universities and colleges involved in the Going for Gold program. You'll get a chance to meet, you should take the chance to meet them during breaks at the dinner tonight. And also there are some digital showcase stands outside where you can get to know them. And we also have several new corporate members of the Roundtable. And we've had a nice expansion of membership this year. And it's an expansion not just in numbers, but in heterogeneity. So more points on that network that you need to really solve problems in cancer. So get to know them as well. I think you'll be excited about it as well. Now to start the program, we have a great list of speakers today, and our great friend Ned Sharpless here is going to moderate for us. Again, another person who's always supported us, and it's just, and he even kind of moved around his schedule just to be with us today. So that's really feels good, and Ned he'll be the great moderator. But I'm going to turn it over now to John McDunn, who's Executive Director in Project DataSphere, and John works on evidence generation and also on sort of development of new opportunities. And I'll hand it over to John to give a proper introduction to Ned and also introduce the format and the content of the programs. So, John.
Well, thanks, Bill. I think today's program is going to be fantastic. You know, after 3 years of Teams and Zoom, we're reminded that we're more than just floating heads. People aren't exactly the same height. And, you know, thankfully, North Carolina is cooperating with us and giving us some fantastic weather today. You know, one of the cornerstones of our group is collaboration. These collaborations have been centered around very human concerns about delivering new medicines to patients who need them the most and streamlining that process through innovations using data science. And it's incredible to have so many dynamic people together with this shared vision and passion. So thank you all for being here. You know, for this year's meeting, we have a series of expert panels that are going to be having a discussion here with Dr. Sharpless. And those discussions will be focused on gaps in cancer care and clinical trials, and especially those gaps that are due to long-standing disparities. These panels will examine this issue from the varied perspectives of our membership, nonprofits, technology and pharma, and academia. And a goal of this meeting is to take note of common threads across these panels and to consider how our organization, the CEO Roundtable and Project Datasphere, might work with this community to collaborate and accelerate and amplify efforts to close the gaps that we identify. I'd like to invite our first panel to come up and help us set the stage by providing their perspective as leaders from the Nonprofit Center. The series of panels will be moderated by Ed Sharpless, co-CEO of Jupiter Bioventures, immediate past director of the National Cancer Institute, and former acting commissioner of the FDA. So thank you.
I think they're coming back. So yeah, we're going to invite our panelists now. Good afternoon, everyone. First, we have Dana Dornsife, who's from the Lazarex Cancer Foundation, and then Susanna Greer, who's from the V Foundation, and lastly, Gary Puckrein from the National Minority Equality Forum. And so we're going to have a seat here, and we'll get started. Maybe I'd also like to thank SAS for hosting this again. This is such a beautiful venue this time of year, and Dr. Goodnight for your support for the years. It's really great to be back in person. So I'm going to start off by asking everybody to kind of introduce themselves. And so why don't you tell me what you do and what your foundation does or your organization does, and what do you sort of think is the biggest problem in this space of equity, inclusion, and access that you're focused on right now. So we'll start with you, Dana.
Okay, I'm Dana Dornsife. I'm the founder, Chief Mission and Strategy Officer for Lazarex Cancer Foundation. And I started Lazarex 16 years ago to help patients navigate through cancer clinical trial options and then provide financial assistance to them on a sliding scale so they could actually afford the out-of-pocket travel expense associated with clinical trial participation for themselves and a caregiver. And then that led us to doing some pretty focused work out in the community in our at-risk communities of color. And so I guess in 2 words, the greatest challenge is equitable access across the board. So that means to address the out-of-pocket costs associated with cancer clinical trial participation, equitable access to insurance products. Many people, well, people here probably do realize it, but many people out in the general public really don't have an appreciation that the type of insurance they have is actually what determines the type of cancer treatment or clinical trials that they might have access to. And then finally, it would be currently comprehensive genomic testing. We still have an access barrier around that, and in the development of precision medicines and targeted therapies, that's really critical that we have equitable access to genomic testing in order for everyone to take advantage of it.
Great. How about you, Susanna?
Thank you, Ned. My name is Susanna Greer. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for the V Foundation for Cancer Research. And I love to talk to folks in North Carolina because this is where our organization was founded. If you are a basketball fan, there is no doubt you are familiar with our founder, Jimmy Valvano, who have really paved the way for this incredible organization. We'll celebrate our 30th year this year, which is just fantastic. Our mission for our organization is victory over cancer, and we accomplish that by funding in a space where, I'm sure we'll talk about this today, nonprofits have to make hard decisions about where to strategically direct their funds, and we direct ours primarily at early stage investigators. Our funding model is through a peer review that is by, I am of course completely biased, but I would say the most distinguished scientific advisory committee in the United States. In order to apply for our grants, an individual has to be working at a distinguished cancer center. There's 71 of them now in the United States. And then each of those centers can nominate one individual for each of our legacy grant programs, and those 71 individuals go on to compete against each other. We have lots of funding models, but those that will be interesting for you to hear about today and that we'll talk about, probably more the second, but the first is called a V-Scholar, and that's for assistant professors who have yet to receive funding from the National Cancer Institute or the NIH in any substantial way. The second is more relevant to our conversation today, I imagine, and that's our V-Translational Scholars. That does not have the restriction on being an early-stage investigator. You can be at any stage in your career, but your research has to end in a clinical trial. So that's something that I'll be excited for us to talk about. The biggest challenge, I think, based on what I've shared with you, the mission of the V is around several things, but I think the easiest way to summarize it is you have to see it to be it. It's really hard to think of yourself as being a cancer researcher or a cancer clinician if you have never interacted with an individual who looks like you from that community. So we spend lots of time thinking about workforce issues and very specifically promoting funding for underserved populations to join the cancer research workforce and the cancer clinical care workforce. And then on the flip side, we think a lot about clinical trial engagement and how we can enable increased participation for underserved populations through our translational program. So thank you.
Great. Gary?
Good afternoon. I'm Gary Puckrein. I'm president of the National Minority Quality Forum. We are a research and education group based in Washington, D.C. Most people know us by our data. We've been collecting data now for about 20 years. We have a database of over 5 billion patient records. We collect data on about 160 million lives a year, covering well over 100,000 different conditions. Program I want to talk to you about this morning is a program that we launched called the Cancer Stage Shifting Initiative. And so the challenge is that with minority populations, African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, they get diagnosed late for cancer, and as a consequence, their survival rates are poor. There's some new technology coming on stream called multi-cancer early detection screenings that detect 50 cancers at one time, have the ability to signal cancer before the patient is symptomatic. As a consequence of DNA fragments being broken off in the blood, and they're able to pick up those fragments. So we see that technology, along with standard technology, as a way to begin addressing this late-stage diagnosis of minority populations. So we are enrolling about 10,000 patients into 2 clinical studies using those MSIDs is what they're called, and to try to, one, understand those MSIDs as they touch minority populations, but also once they get diagnosed, how does the system respond in terms of access to care? So we're following them from the moment of diagnosis through access to care. And one of the challenges with the MSIDs is because we're diagnosing before the patient is symptomatic, it means that most of the treatments that we have are for late-stage diagnosis of cancer and not early-stage diagnosis of cancer. And so we want to not just follow those patients into treatment, but establish some sort of registry so that we can learn about how are we treating these patients in late stage. So we work with fairly qualified health clinics down at the community level. They're the ones who we have a grant from FDA to train them to do clinical research. We also work with clinicians in private practice because they're the ones that have the patients. So we're literally in community getting those patients diagnosed, and the idea is then to follow them through the course of care.
Wow, these are really interesting. So, talking about access to clinical trials, workforce development, and big data for minority populations in particular is a very exciting topic of MSID. So let me ask some more questions about those. So Dana, I've been trying to get more diverse patients on clinical trials my entire career, and I feel like this has never gone well. The NCI is consumed with this topic. The FDA is even more consumed with this topic, but we haven't moved the needle as much as we would have liked. I think you hit the nail on the head, though. When you really look at why this is, these sort of barriers of taking a day off from work and parking and access to care and driving 3 hours and sitting in traffic. So How do you plan to address that? What are you guys going to do about that?
Oh my goodness, there's so much work to be done, and you're exactly right. But I think we are, in my opinion as a patient advocate, not really focusing our efforts where they really need to be focused. And so, you know, people talk about the barriers to clinical trial participation, knowledge, financial constraints, you know, historical issues around trust, support network, all of those things, right? And, you know, for a long time, Lazarex spent a lot of money and a lot of effort to help educate people around clinical trials, and then to remove the financial barrier, you know, so patients could get where they needed to be in order to take advantage of medical breakthroughs in technology. And what I learned in doing that at both just the generic, organic, you know, out in the community, and then a specific program at the comprehensive cancer center level, is that we can do all of the educating and provide all the financial assistance needed to do that. But if someone has insurance that is prohibitive, right, you know, then they're going to be relegated to be seen at a clinic that offers this many clinical trials. So what does that do to our diversity? It kills it, right? And the numbers that we see are reflective of that. And because poverty disproportionately impacts, you know, our communities of color, we really need to be place-based, community-led, you know, and culturally appropriate in our approach that we take with our communities of color. And so that's really where we're focusing our time on now, starting at the beginning of the continuum of cancer care and working toward the end of clinical trials where, you know, hopefully by the time we get there, we will have earned the respect and the trust that we need in order to make that transition from the treatment pathway to clinical trials.
I don't know exactly how to solve that problem, but do you think it would be a good thing if those clinics that these patients are being referred to had access to clinical? I mean, if they had trials open, wouldn't that be one way of sort of addressing this problem?
Well, absolutely, yes. So decentralized trials, expansion of, you know, access to clinical trials would be fantastic. But also, you know, allowing patients, you know, the luxury of being able to go where the trials are as well, which right now that is a no-go.
Really hard. Yeah. Susanna, you want to tell us, you know, I love the focus on NCI-designated cancer centers. As former director of an NCI-designated cancer center, that's music to my ears, and those are faculty that really need support, and they have these very low pay lines from the NIH, particularly around cancer. It's great to have somebody supporting them, but that does have this problem that you only get the scientists at cancer centers. So what are your thoughts on that topic? Absolutely.
Well, so I should say I've been at the V Foundation 6 months, so just enough time to be dangerous. But what I have done are environmental scans to find out who are we serving, who are we funding, and I will say there's good news, and then there are areas for us to work on. The good news is that since 2015, the V Foundation has put our money where our mouth is around our interest in workforce and in addressing the challenge that if we've decided to only fund individuals who are working at designated cancer centers, what do we do when designated cancer centers don't have a lot of researchers working at them that look like the people, sorry, Ned, excluding you, from here on, right, the three of us. So one thing that the V has done, which has been great, is that we do allow designated cancer centers to submit 2 grant applications to the V Foundation if one of the applicants is from an underrepresented community and or if one of the applicants is doing research that impacts communities of color and cancer. So that is one way that from 2015 on, which I wish we had started earlier, but from 2015 on, we have significantly increased the number of underrepresented researchers and clinicians that have been funded by the V Foundation. So that's one thing we have done. The second piece, though, is it's interesting because one of the things that you shared, Dana, was that you're starting at the beginning, and we aren't, right? So that the challenge comes that the V Foundation can only begin to work with folks once they've already made the decision to be a researcher or a clinician. They're way down the pipeline. And we are interested and have submitted several grants, actually, since I've been at the V Foundation, to industry to fund a pipeline program where we would focus on HBCUs, where HBCUs would compete against each other. I've met with provosts from the university system of North Carolina and Georgia to really talk about what are the challenges in this space, and they look different. So helping researchers who are at HBCUs and who are training the future generations in STEM to encourage them and to give them time to do that research, time to have that mentoring aspect with their students. So, any of you CEOs out there that are interested in talking to me, I would be very interested in talking to you. I think it's a fantastic program that we hope to launch in 23. So I think it's we're not all the way there, but we're definitely making inroads. And, you know, we put our money where our mouth is. We have a 100% giving pledge. Every dollar you give to research goes to research. And I do think we are funding the most outstanding science. But if everyone's not at the table, our job is unfinished. So.
It's really wonderful. Gary, I got to ask you about the MSID thing. I think that this is such a fascinating topic. So can you sort of give me a little more info on how this trial is working? Is the patients are at federally qualified health centers generally?
Sure.
And how many and sort of, and who, what if they're positive? What happens then?
So where I would start is in the work that we're doing with the FQAC, federally qualified health clinics. I have the Washington, D.C.s. I abbreviate everything. The challenge is that they are not built to do clinical research. And so one of the things that we found out that we had to do was put study coordinators into the practice because given their patient panels, they were never going to be able to do clinical trials on their own. So that's a really important piece of information that if you're going to put trials into diverse communities, you're going to have to beef those practices up so that they can actually do clinical research. And we take on all the back-end work of data collection and all of that sort of thing. You cannot put that on the practice. But what's important is they have the patients, they have the trust of the community, they're in community, so the transportation issues are there. Now, on the MSIDs, what's interesting about the MSIDs, it's a blood draw, essentially. You know, the patient comes in. Typically, you want to do it during their normal, wellness visit. You draw some blood, and that's the sum of it. Somewhere around 2%, maybe a little less, of those who get the blood draw are diagnosed. And here, we're talking about patients who are not symptomatic, which is really important. These are early stage, potentially early stage patients. The problem right now is that most of these tests are not FDA cleared, so they're not reimbursable by Medicare and Medicaid, which raises the next problem of referral them into care. And so that's part of our work. It's not just doing clinical research, it's also trying to understand how is the system going to respond to this signal. And what we've seen to date is not generalized across the population, but the system is responding well in terms of taking the referral and then confirming the potential cancer. And as I said earlier, the next challenge is really the treatment channel, right? Because we don't know how to treat patients early stage cancer because we haven't had a lot of them, like pancreatic cancer, for example. One of these 50 cancers you get to diagnose pancreatic cancer where there is no screenings right now. And so there are 5 cancers that have screenings, and so 45 of them that are being covered have no screenings whatsoever. Just to be candid, I think our system is moving slowly in terms of how it's responding to these MSIDs. My mindset is more like we did with COVID, which is we got to fly the plane and build the plane as we're going along, because what's happening right now is that the tests are about $900. That's anybody can go get it who's got $900. And what that means is if you take it out 10 years and we don't treat those patients or make those tests available, we're going to start walking around with populations who have tumors because they're poor and populations who don't have tumors because they're affluent. And that's not a good-looking picture at all. And so part of our work is really to try to accelerate the process. We think of these MSIDs as part of the end stage of the war on cancer that Nixon declared. I think we're at that point where we're getting smart enough to say it's not the end, but it's the beginning of the end. And certainly we want to make sure that we bring all populations along.
Yeah, it's a really exciting vision. I think President Biden has set a top goal of the new cancer moonshot is to reduce cancer mortality by 50% in 25 years. And this is a technology that could help with that. I mean, a lot of the things that we do in cancer aren't so impactful for mortality, but that is definitely one. But tell me, if you're Mr. Smith, you have this positive blood test that says you may or may not have cancer somewhere in your body, and we're not exactly sure. That conversation is probably very challenging for the affluent, educated patient in San Francisco who gets it as on their own dime for $900. But how does that conversation go in a federally qualified health center?
Well, the first thing, this is another place where you can't put that pressure back on the clinic itself because they do not have the capacity in terms of time to answer that. So what we've done is put navigators in to have that conversation with the patient and then begin to get them into care. I must say, to be blunt, I took the test, right? So I'm not advocating something that I didn't do on myself. I went and did it. And so there's this anxious moment by the time you take it and the time when your doctor calls up and says, hey, you're okay. So that anxiety is there. I don't think we can take that away. But I think the opportunity to diagnose cancer before it's symptomatic is such an advantage that I don't think we can walk away from that. I think that's the problem. And so, but I think if we're talking about federally qualified clinics and we're talking about physicians in private practice, this is a primary care tool. This is not an oncology tool. This is a tool for private in primary care. We have to figure out how to support primary care in order to do that because primary care is already underwater. And if you add this to the burden, you're just going to blow the system up. So I think there's a lot of work and thinking that has to happen before we can generalize these tests.
It reminds me a little bit of the early days of somatic mutation testing in cancer, and you'd send the oncologist, your patient has a cyclin D1 mutation, and they'd say, what's cyclin D1? Very frustrated doctors on the receiving end of that information. So it's a little bit like that, I think. This is so new. Dana, you said something really interesting I didn't know. And you said that you think access to somatic genetic testing is now a barrier to participation in clinical trials that particularly affects vulnerable populations. Did I hear that right?
Yes.
And how do we fix that?
Well, I mean, that's all about, engagement at the policy and legislative level, which I would invite the CEO roundtable to, right? Well, and you were responsible for helping us get our FDA language in 2018, which really was a game changer. And so that, to me, was an indicator that all things are possible. And that if we, a lot of smart people in this room, and if we all put our heads together and understand from the stakeholders' perspective what a true core shift in insurance would mean. And maybe we just, initially single out cancer because of the nature of cancer itself, right? If you don't have access to either standard of care or standard of care fails, you don't have access to clinical trials, you will die, right? It's not like you have another drug that you could try. But, again, we have the there are, I'm not going to recall the statistics off the top of my head, but I want to say it's maybe like 35% of our African American community is either or under insured. Mortality rates are much higher, being diagnosed later stage. And this all really has to do with understanding the social determinants of health and the type of insurance that individuals are offered. And I mean, if you just have a little bit of insurance and you happen to have a cancer diagnosis, it really doesn't help, right? And so we can jump through all the hoops we want to jump through, and we can create all of the precision medicine and all these amazing, advances in treatment that we can. But the bottom line is you're going to accelerate the gap and widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots if we don't figure out the insurance piece and equitable access to treatment and clinical trials along the way. And it needs to be done concurrently. We don't want to get here on the treatment side and still be here on the access side. So I would suggest that, we can all do a better job.
Well, I'm enjoying this, but I forgot to look at our timekeeper, and my one job as moderator, I failed that. But let's see if we can open it up for some questions here, because we do have a little bit of time left for that. If there are questions in the audience, anyone would like to ask, raise your hand. And if you do ask a question, make sure you push down your little button. Anyone? Over there. Sure. Push the little button there. It's like the UN. The red light's got to go on, I think. There you go. Oh, you might have to hold it.
So for a long time, the NIH has proposed that diverse populations be included in clinical trials. And that's been for about 34 years. That has never happened. And so the doctor that said we have to do something about access, we can't keep it there, I think this is an important goal to have. And that is to be able to provide the insurance that give you the access to these clinical trials. When you look at pharmaceutical trials where you have recruitment, still you see diverse populations left out of those clinical trials. Even for medications that they are heavily impacted, disproportionately impacted by. And so at the very highest level of clinical trials, clinical medicine, insurance, and so forth, there has to be a fundamental change for this to change.
So Ned, if I could just jump in and very quickly just share with the audience a statistic. For our IMPACT program, Improving Patient Access to Cancer Clinical Trials, which was conducted at the Comprehensive Cancer Center level. It's a 3-year program. Our first cohort was with UCSF in San Francisco and USC Norris in Los Angeles. Our whole premise was that if we engaged with a patient during the consent process and introduced them to our travel reimbursement program, that we could eliminate that financial barrier from the beginning of the patient's decision-making equation. Upon conclusion of that program in 2020, the end of 2020, despite COVID, we had achieved 63% minority participation, with 52% of those participants coming from households earning $25,000 a year or less. Mm-hmm. So it does show that it is possible to create equitable access. We just have to be creative around how we get the job done.
If I could add to Dana, I think I can. So credit to Ned and the NCI. If we look at the cancer population for underrepresented communities, specifically focusing on Black patients, they were, I think, 13.6% of the U.S. population were African American last year, and from clinical trial enrollment, from trials sponsored by the government, the participation in clinical trials was over 12%. But you're exactly right. From pharmaceutical companies, it was less than 3%. So for places like ours, where we think about what can we do from the very beginning, we think about engaging our researchers and our clinicians with collaborators who have already established best practices. and already are engaging communities of color in clinical trials and trying to learn from them, right? There's no reason for us to reinvent the wheel. And so I wonder what is the regulatory step that is missing in pharmaceutical trials that expectation hasn't been elevated, because if the government can do it, right? Any of us can do it. So it absolutely mystifies me. So
Thank you for mentioning that statistic. I should say that's a lot of work at the NCI for decades before I got there, and will persist after I left. Doug Lowy was a big supporter of that forever. Doug is here, and made this a major focus of his time in federal government. And I also, people like Warden McCaskill-Stevens and others of the NCI really prioritize this. And the data have gotten better, but that's not across the entire NIH, and that's not even across the entire NCI. There are pockets of strength, and it's trials that we can do in community sites that tended to do better than the phase 3 trial, or the tertiary care trials that happen at Sloan Kettering. So there's still a lot of barriers. Right there.
Yes, I have a question. It was mentioned about study coordinators in physicians' offices. What does that look like as we move forward, realizing that the staff itself are not trained appropriately to be able to conduct the studies, and there's a trust factor there, which the patients may already have with their medical physician. So how do we bridge that to be inclusive of more studies working with the actual medical providers?
So what we do, two things. One is we provide a grant to the site so that they hire the study coordinator in consultation with us. We encourage them to find a staff person, because we then do train them to do clinical research. We started this, it wasn't cancer, it was in COVID. We went through a school of hard knocks trying to sort that out, because clinical trials are very precise, and sometimes that gets lost, people who are not accustomed to doing clinical trials. But once we get them trained, and then we have staff that come on site. We also brought in a contract research organization to continue and be there as part of the research family, if you will, to support them. I think this is critically important, though, because they're also transferring information to the population that they serve, right? It's not just that we're helping them do clinical trials, but they're also communicating to the broader community about clinical trials, because people have all kinds of ideas about clinical trials. Many of them don't match reality. And so it becomes a learning community, is the way we sort of think about it, by bringing those folks in. And so I think if we're going to be serious about doing clinical trials and bringing in diverse populations, we have to do them in those practices and support those practices to do clinical trials. And once they get it, the work is very clean, and we're writing papers coming from it, so we're confident in the data that we're collecting from.
One last one here, maybe.
We have a different challenge. We're a small company. We develop first-in-class 3-drug-in-1 tablets. You can have access to all the patients on the privilege on the serve. But with the clinical trial, enrollment is a challenge. That impact by COVID, many other things. So we want people to join our trial, but how can we do better working together? So that's my challenge.
Cancer and oncology poses a particular problem to do clinical trials in community, because a lot of the cancer research is done in academic centers. The number of community oncologists who are actually practicing is decreasing, if you will. And so we've had to go to great lengths in partnerships to identify, because we're interested in those community oncologists. We're trying to bring this into the community. And so we've had to go to great lengths to identify those community clinicians. Some of them have done some trials, but most of them are naive. And again, the issue is getting them trained, getting their staff trained, et cetera. We don't see that in sort of diabetes or cardiovascular. Oncology has presented a particular problem for us in terms of identifying those community clinicians who can do studies.
So we'll wrap up our first panel here, but before I do, I want to give each of our speakers just a few seconds to sort of give your executive summary and the thing you want to leave the CEO roundtable with. So we'll go in reverse order this time. Gary, maybe we'll start with you.
Cancer stage shifting. This is the beginning of the end of the war on cancer, and we need deep collaborations in order to do this successfully. So I would just encourage everyone who walks out of here to think about stage shifting. How do we take late-stage cancer and get it to early stage? Because the minute we do that, we're going to improve survival rates. We're going to get better outcomes for patients.
I'll tag on to what Gary said and share that. So 80% of the population of North Carolina receives their cancer care in community settings. So one of the things at the V that we encourage all of our investigators to do, and they're reviewed when they submit their applications, is how are you working with community cancer centers? How are you engaging with faith-based communities? And what are you doing? And so it's a push. So I think no matter where we sit on this spectrum, we all have to continue to push and drive and really put our money where our mouth is about these issues that we hold near and dear.
And I'm going to finish with the two words I started out with, which are equitable access, and how we achieve that across the continuum of care, each step of the way, identifying what the barriers are and what we can do to eliminate those barriers so that we can actually achieve a platform of equitable access.
Well, very good. Let's thank our three panelists, and we'll move on to the next one.